Remains, Irish massacre. 4,000 Protestants killed by the Catholics.
In November 1641, a new crisis blew away all hope of compromise between the King and Parliament. News reached London that Irish Catholics had risen in revolt and had driven Protestant settlers from their homes in a wave of massacres and burnings.
It says in here, they took a man and they hung him from his own tree. Arthur Robinson, his daughter, 14 years old she was. A gang of these Irish rebels held her down and raped her one by one. And then they cut out her tongue. Once again in the name of the Pope.
All in the name of the Pope.
It's impossible to say how true these stories were, but they spread like wildfire, transforming the political situation in Westminster. They fueled paranoia about a Catholic invasion of England. Rumours abounded about the Queen's involvement. People feared the King might use Irish troops to suppress rebellion in England and Scotland.
There is great anger. Someone has put it in the people's minds that this Irish rebellion was contrived or stirred up by the King or the Queen to advance popery. They're even saying that the rebels had the King's authority to do what they did. This is a calumny. There's not even a shadow of truth in it. But it's made more impression on the minds of sober and moderate men than could ever be imagined.
On November the 8th, 1641, the mood was ugly. Crowds demonstrated outside the Commons. Mobs desecrated churches throughout the country. John Pym seized his moment. He presented a document called the Grand Remonstrance to the House of Commons. It was an unprecedented move. The document was a blistering attack on the King's rule.
Of subverting the fundamental laws and principles of government by introducing
had been oppressed by fines, imprisonments, stigmatizings, mutilations, whippings,
pillories, gags, confinement.
A malignant and pernicious design still cried for vengeance to continue and multiply and enlarge their...
as were fittest for accommodation with popery.
More controversial still was Pym's demand that the remonstrance be printed and distributed to the public. Never in its history had Parliament demanded to speak to the people.
The King's honour is at stake. The people must be told the truth.
Aye.
These plots have emanated from the court and from the papists there.
No papists.
These popish lords obstruct the House, and so do the bishops.
No bishops.
And they have driven a wedge between the King and his people by introducing altar worship and idolatry into our cathedrals. Such things are nothing short of popery.
More significantly, for the first time, Parliament called for the right to overrule the King. It was the first step towards making the House of Commons the body that ruled the country.
The King must rid himself of these evil men who surround him. We have suffered enough at their hands. He must remove papists from court and replace his advisers with those approved by Parliament.
No papists.
Making the remonstrance available to the public was a landmark in parliamentary history. Debates in the House of Commons were private and reporting them illegal. Till now, Parliament was the privilege of the few. Ordinary people were not thought fit to be involved in political matters. For some MPs like Edward Hyde, publishing was a step too far.
This remonstrance is unnecessary. The King has already addressed all our grievances and granted us everything that we have asked of him. And to publish it without the approval of the Lords is unlawful. It will just inflame the mob. Protests like this should be addressed to the King, not to the people. Only he can redress our grievances. We are not here to please the people.
The debate about whether to print the remonstrance was one of the most important in Commons history. At stake was nothing less than MPs' right to say publicly what they thought. It was also one of the most heated debates in history. Fights broke out. MPs screamed and waved their hats. Some even banged on the floor with their swords. One member was dragged off to the Tower for his unruly behaviour. But eventually MPs voted 135 to 83 in favour of printing the remonstrance. It was an historic moment. For the first time, Parliament dared to speak not just to the King, but to the people. London was in ferment. Angry crowds regularly thronged round Westminster, demonstrating against the king and his bishops. The king had his supporters too. Violence erupted between the two sides. For the first time, people shouted the words Roundhead and Cavalier as insults. The king now made a fateful move. He decided to arrest Pym and 5 of his parliamentary colleagues, the men he felt were the cause of all his troubles. It was a drastic course of action. Taking soldiers into Parliament was a highly provocative act.
Stand aside! Make way for the king!
But Pym had been tipped off. The king had fallen into his trap. Pym and his colleagues waited long enough to ensure the king was coming and then slipped away. Charles spent all of 20 minutes in the chamber, the first and last time an English monarch had been inside the House of Commons. An assistant clerk to the Speaker recorded what happened.
His Majesty came in and walked up to the Speaker. All of the members stood up. His Majesty said, "Mr. Speaker, I must make bold with your chair," and he sat down. The King then said how sorry he was that he had to come here because no one was more conscious of the House's privileges than he was. But in cases of treason, no one could claim privilege. So he'd come to see if any of the people he'd accused were there because he was determined to arrest them wherever he could find them. Then the King looked around and asked, "Is Mr. Pym there?" No one said anything, so he asked Mr. Speaker if the 5 members were present. When he still didn't get an answer, he said, "I see all my birds have flown, but I expect you to send them to me when they return." Finally, the King said that they had his word that he wouldn't use force against them, but would act without force and in a legal way. And then His Majesty got up and left.
Ordinary people reacted to the failed arrest of Pym with demonstrations supporting the MPs. They chanted Parliament, the privileges of Parliament, and denounced the King. Charles's response was to flee the capital. With his wife and 3 of his children, he reached Hampton Court Palace so unexpectedly that all 5 of them had to sleep in one bed. Before long, he headed north. Pym returned to Westminster a popular hero, though within 2 years he would be dead from cancer. Meanwhile, the King's supporters were in disarray.
The truth is, the actions of the king have affected everybody. They've encouraged his enemies. Those who laughed at tales of plots against Parliament now believe them. The court has never been held at such low esteem. The people are at a loss. The city has shut up its shops as if an enemy were at the gate. Those of us who showed the courage to challenge the opposition's seditious activities, the king's followers, are confounded at what he's done, grief-stricken, fearful of what might follow.
After the King's botched attempt to arrest Pym, Edward Hyde left London to join Charles. The King was determined to reimpose his will on Parliament. From his temporary base in York, he set about raising money and recruiting troops. Parliament, fearing the King's intentions, also began to arm itself. The country grew unstable and dangerous. Lucy Hutchinson, who a year earlier had defaced her local church in the name of Puritanism, feared the threat of royalist soldiers. She decided to pack up, leave her poorly protected house in Othorpe, and take her children to join her husband in the safety of a parliamentary garrison. England now drifted towards civil war. Parliament's support came mainly from the city and the counties around London, where Puritanism was strong. The north and west favoured the king. Many people wanted to stay out of it. Others had to make a very difficult decision: which side to back. As devout Puritans, Lucy Hutchinson and her husband sympathised with Parliament, but it was still a choice that split their family. John's first cousin, Sir Richard Byron, was a staunch royalist. He sent a message to the Hutchinsons warning of dire consequences if John and Lucy backed Parliament.
Sir Richard sent a message out of tender affection, desiring him to consider his wife and children, and the loss of his estate, which would be inevitable, he said, if John persisted in his support of Parliament. John replied he would never betray a cause in which he believed. As for his estate, I am as willing as John is to lose it. He would never waver in the defence of a cause to which God had called him.
By August 1642, 8 months after his humiliating departure from London, Charles felt he had enough soldiers to declare war on Parliament. The king marked the event by raising the royal standard in Nottingham. The soldiers who watched could not have known the horrors of war ahead. For the last 50 years, England had enjoyed a remarkable period of peace and prosperity. Now religion plunged an ill-prepared country into the bloodiest conflict to take place on its soil. Edward Hyde, now one of Charles's advisors, witnessed the declaration of war.
It's done. The king has set up his standard here at Nottingham. Some thought he should have delayed it. Some thought, too, it would have been better done at York, where he could have marshalled a proper army instead of gathering men up as he marched south. But the king thought that delay would be a sign of weakness. There have been storms all day, violent winds. The king rode out this evening with what attendants he could find. Varney was the standard bearer, and at 6:30, he planted it on the top of Castle Hill. It was very little ceremony. Just a drum roll and a trumpet. The king seemed more melancholy than usual. Indeed, there's an air of sadness over everyone today. The arms and ammunition haven't arrived from York. We haven't a single regiment of foot soldiers. The only guard for the king is a group of militia rounded up by the sheriff. The standard was blown over in the wind an hour ago.
The ensuing 4 years of civil war were chaotic and bloody. It was hard to tell one side from another. There were 9 major battles, but most of the fighting consisted of sieges and skirmishes. The war's cost in lives was appalling. Over the next few years, 70,000 were killed in the fighting, and another 100,000 died from the war's effects, especially disease. Lucy Hutchinson was with her husband John, defending Nottingham Castle for Parliament. She saw the suffering first-hand among the royalist prisoners in the castle's makeshift hospital.
Could you bring this boy some water, please?
Yes.
"3,000 royalist troops surrounded the town and marched onto the castle this morning. But thanks be to God, our soldiers managed to drive them back. They were outnumbered, but showed great courage. Though I must be honest and admit the enemy was defeated as much by the long march through the snow as by the gallantry of our men. There was courage on both sides. Cowardice too. We lost only one man today, the Royalist 40, and 80 of them were brought in as prisoners. Some of them were wounded, and I asked the captain to bring them to me. He was furious and asked me why I wanted to help the enemy. We are all God's creatures, I told him, and it was my Christian duty to help them. I'm afraid he didn't agree, but he brought them to me, and I dressed their wounds as best I could. There were so many wounded. They left a trail of blood behind them as they retreated. 2 miles long. It froze in the snow.
For 3 years the war dragged on. Neither side was able to gain the upper hand. Casualties mounted, the economy deteriorated, and suffering was widespread. But then the tide turned against the king. Wars are unpredictable, not least in the leaders they produce. They now emerged from relative obscurity. A man who not only transformed Parliament's army and reversed its military fortunes, but went on to become one of the giants of English history. He was, of course, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a country farmer from East Anglia with no experience of warfare. Yet he turned out to be a natural military genius and an inspirational cavalry commander. In 1645, he was the driving force behind the creation of the New Model Army, Britain's first professional army. Its soldiers were properly trained, paid, and thoroughly motivated. Cromwell was not concerned with status and position. He was one of the few parliamentary commanders not in awe of the king. Cromwell demanded committed Puritans in his army, soldiers prepared to fight and die for their religion.
Silence I as dumb became, I did myself restrain from speaking good, but then the more increased was my pain.
John Lilburne was a volunteer in the New Model. He shared Cromwell's religious fervour and, like many officers in the army, read his men the Bible to inspire them. 6 years earlier, Lilburne had been flogged and pilloried by the Star Chamber for his Puritan beliefs. He had fought bravely for Parliament, been captured and exchanged. He would end the war as a lieutenant colonel of the horse.
My wife secured me a good place with the government, but I couldn't accept it, and it upset her greatly. But how could I sit back on 1,000 a year while the peace and liberty of our country was still at stake? I'd rather be fighting for 8 pence a day. My good friend Colonel Cromwell asked me to serve with him in the Eastern Association here in Lincoln. How could I refuse? He's a man with a spirit for freedom.
By 1645, Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army had all but won the war. At the Battle of Naseby, they routed the king's infantry and seized his munitions. Within another 6 months, they'd captured all the remaining castles and cities in Royalist hands. Parliament's victory was complete. Charles gave himself up to the Scots, who were at that time allies of Parliament. After the Royalist defeat, Edward Hyde escaped to Jersey, from where he surveyed the ruin of all his hopes and began to write his great history of the war.
5 years ago, England was enjoying the greatest sense of well-being it had ever known. We were prosperous and at peace, but in the midst of all that happiness, a small, hardly discernible cloud arose in the north, heralding the most violent storm imaginable. Its strength uprooted the greatest cedars in the country, blasted its beauty and fruitfulness, brought its strength to decay, and its glory to disgrace and desolation.